They said any man Elias Crow touched would end up buried before the week was over. And in Whisper Creek, people believed that kind of thing the way they believed in dust storms and dry wells, as something you didn't question, only endured. So when he walked down Main Street, boots slow, hat low, the air seemed to shift around him, doors half closed, conversations dying mid-sentence, even the wind carrying less sound. Like the town itself was holding its breath, and Elias never looked at anyone. Not because he was proud, but because he knew what he'd see if he did. Fear, quiet and sharp, sitting in their eyes like a loaded gun no one wanted to fire. And maybe that was fair. Maybe a man who had outlived 3 others who should have made it didn't deserve much else. Maybe silence was the only thing left for him. But Clara Whitfield didn't see it that way. Not entirely. She stood behind the counter of her father's pharmacy, sleeves rolled, hands steady over glass bottles and folded bandages, watching him through the window like she was trying to read a language no one had taught her. She had heard the stories. Of course she had. Everyone had. How a ranch hand collapsed after Elias tried to help him. How a traveler never woke after sharing his fire. How even the preacher once said some men carried storms inside them. But Clara had also noticed the smaller things, the way Elias always stepped aside first, even when he didn't have to, the way he never entered a room unless asked, the way his hands, rough and scarred, never reached for anything that wasn't freely given, and that didn't look like a man people should fear, not entirely. It looked like a man who had learned something the hard way and never forgot it. And then it happened, fast and quiet, like most things that matter. A horse startled near the hitching post, a sharp movement, a young boy thrown hard into the dirt. The kind of fall that makes a crowd gather but keeps it just far enough away. Boots forming a circle, voices low, uncertain, no one stepping in because no one wanted to be the first to do the wrong thing. And in that hesitation, in that thin slice of time where fear decides what men do, Elias Crow moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just forward, one step, then another, until he knelt beside the boy, his shadow falling across the dust, and the crowd shifted like something sacred had been broken. Someone muttered for him to stay back, another voice sharper, louder, telling him he'd only make it worse. But Elias didn't answer. He never did. He just lowered his head, hands steady now, like they belonged to someone who remembered exactly what to do. And Clara saw it, not the fear everyone else was clinging to, but the quiet in him, the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. And before she realized she was moving, she stepped out from behind the counter, pushed through the watching bodies, and walked straight toward the man everyone else had already judged. Because in that moment, with the sun cutting through dust and silence pressing in from every side, Clara Whitfield understood something the rest of Whisper Creek refused to see. That's sometimes the most dangerous thing in a town isn't the man everyone fears, but the truth no one is willing to look at. The boy's breathing steadied under Elias Crow's hands. Not all at once, not like a miracle, but slowly, like something choosing to stay instead of leave. And that was when the tension shifted, not outward, but inward, into the silence that followed, because no one knew what to say when the thing they feared did not happen, when the man they avoided did not bring ruin, but instead held it back with nothing more than quiet patience. And Clara Whitfield felt it in the way the crowd loosened just a fraction, boots scraping dust, eyes darting, searching for someone else to decide what this meant. But Elias did not look up. He did not wait for approval or acknowledgement. He simply adjusted his hands with care that spoke of long practice, of nights spent doing the same thing in places far worse than this street. And Clara knelt beside him, close enough now to see the lines in his face, the kind carved by years, not anger, not cruelty, but something heavier, something carried without complaint. And she reached for the cloth at her side, offering it without a word. And for the briefest moment, Elias hesitated, not because he did not need it, but because he was not used to being offered anything at all. Then he took it, a small nod, almost invisible, and pressed it gently where it was needed. And the boy's mother finally pushed through the circle, her fear louder than reason, her voice breaking as she called her son's name. But when she saw him breathing, saw Elias step back instead of forward, something in her expression faltered, confusion replacing certainty. And that was the moment Clara would remember later. Not the fear, not the whispers, but the hesitation. first crack in a story the town had been telling itself for years, and Elias rose slowly, dust settling around his boots, his eyes never meeting anyone else's, and he moved to leave the same way he had arrived, quiet, unnoticed if not for the space people made without thinking. But Clara stood, brushing dirt from her hands, watching him like she had seen something unfinished, something that did not belong to the past people kept repeating. And behind her, the murmurs returned, softer now, uncertain, as if the town itself was trying to decide whether it had been wrong all along. But no one said it out loud, not yet, because admitting that kind of mistake required more courage than most people carried. And Elias walked toward the edge of town, toward the place where the buildings thinned and the land stretched wide and empty, the kind of place a man could disappear into without leaving a mark. And Clara felt a pull she could not explain, not toward danger, not toward mystery, but toward understanding, because for the first time, she realized that fear was not always born from truth. Sometimes it was born from silence, from stories left unfinished. And as she watched Elias Crow fade into the afternoon light, she knew that whatever the town believed about him was only part of the story, and the part they refused to see might be the one that mattered most. Clara Whitfield did not return to the counter right away, even after the crowd began to scatter and the boy was carried home in careful arms, because something about the way Elias Crow had stepped back stayed with her, not relief, not pride, but something quieter, something like a man who had done what needed to be done and expected nothing in return, and that kind of silence did not come from a place. People in Whisper Creek understood, so she stood there a moment longer, dust settling around her boots, the late afternoon sun stretching shadows across the street, and then she made a choice that felt small, but carried weight she could not yet measure. She removed her apron, set it neatly on the counter inside the shop, and stepped out into the open road alone, following the direction he had gone, not quickly, not as if chasing, but with the steady pace of someone who had decided to stop, ignoring a question, and the town noticed. Of course it did. People always noticed when someone stepped outside the lines they had agreed upon. A man leaning against the post office straightened, two women near the well fell silent, and someone called her name, soft but warning, but Clara did not turn, because she understood something most of them did not. That fear grows stronger when it is left unchallenged, and she had seen enough to know that what they feared might not be what they thought it was, and the road out of town stretched for nearly half a mile before the buildings gave way to open land, dry grass bending under a slow wind, the kind that carried heat even as the day began to cool. And there, near the edge where the last fence post stood crooked against the horizon, she saw him, Elias Crow, seated on a low wooden rail, his hat resting beside him, his hands still, as if he had been sitting there long before she arrived. And for a moment she hesitated, not out of fear, but because she realized she was stepping into a space no one else in town had dared to enter, a place where stories could no longer protect them from the truth. And when she finally walked the last few yards, the sound of her boots on dry dirt was enough to draw his attention, his head lifting slowly, eyes meeting hers with something that was not surprise, but recognition, like he had been expecting someone, just not sure who. And Clara stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough to show she understood distance. And for a second neither of them said anything, the wind moving between them, carrying the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed wood. And then she spoke, not with accusation, not with fear, but with the kind of quiet certainty that leaves no room for misunderstanding. She said that the boy would be all right, and Elias nodded once, a small movement, as if that was all he needed to hear. And when he reached for his hat, ready to leave before anything else could be said, Clara did something no one in Whisper Creek had ever done before. She took one step closer, and in that single step, she crossed every line the town had drawn around him, not because she was fearless, but because she had begun to understand that sometimes the truth is not hidden in what people say about a man, but in what he does when no one stands beside him. And she had been there, she had seen it, and now she was no longer willing to pretend she had not. Clara Whitfield did not stop when Elias Crow reached for his hat, and that was the moment something shifted, not in the air, not in the land, but in the space between two people who had been taught to remain strangers. Because Elias paused, just long enough to let the silence stretch, and in that pause was a question he did not ask, a warning he did not speak, the kind that said turning back would be easier for both of them. But Clara did not step away. She held her ground with the same quiet steadiness she had shown in the street, and when she spoke again, her voice carried no fear, only a simple truth. She told him that people in town were wrong about him, not loudly, not like a challenge, but like someone, stating a fact that had been waiting too long to be said. And Elias looked at her then, really looked, as if measuring the weight of those words against everything he had learned to expect from others. And for a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes, not hope, not quite, but something close enough to make him still, and he shook his head once, slow, almost tired, as if correcting her without using words. Because men like him did not argue with towns, they simply stepped around them, lived outside their lines, and accepted the distance as part of the cost. But Clara did not accept it. Not anymore. She took another step, closing the space to just a few feet, enough to see the faint scars along his hands, the kind that did not come from fighting but from working, from holding, from trying to keep things together when they were already falling apart. And she asked him a question no one in Whisper Creek had ever asked, not what he had done, not what people said, but why he stayed. And that question landed heavier than any accusation, because it carried no judgment, only curiosity, and Elias did not answer right. Away, the wind moving between them again, brushing dust along the ground like a quiet reminder that time was still passing. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and used. He said he stayed because leaving did not change anything, because the past followed a man whether he walked 10 miles or 100, and Clara listened, really listened, the way few people ever did. And she realized then that what the town feared was not the man in front of her, but the stories they had built around him, stories that made it easier to keep their distance, easier to avoid asking questions that might demand something from them in return. And behind her, far off near the edge of town, a figure stood watching, then another, shaped small against the fading light. Because people always watched when something unfamiliar began to unfold, and Clara knew they were there without turning. Knew the town was waiting to see if she would step back into the place they had chosen for her, but she did not move. She stood beside Elias Crow in the open land where there were no walls, no whispered rules, and for the first time in years, he was not standing alone. And that was enough to make him hesitate before walking away, enough to make the silence between them feel different, not like an ending, but like something that had just begun to change. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint sound of voices from the edge of town, low and uncertain, like people who had gathered not to act, but to witness. And Elias Crow heard it the same way Clara Whitfield did, not as noise, but as pressure, the kind that had followed him from place to place, quiet at first, then heavier the longer he stayed, and he placed his hat back on his head with a slow, practiced motion, the kind that suggested departure more than decision. But he did not move just yet, because something about Clara standing there, unmoving, unafraid, had unsettled a rhythm he had relied on for years, a rhythm built on distance and silence, and leaving before anything could take root. And Clara saw it, not in his eyes, but in the way his shoulders held tension that did not belong to the moment. And she understood then that whatever story the town believed about Elias Crow, it had shaped him just as much as it had shaped them. And before he could step away, she spoke again, softer this time, as if the words were meant only for him and not for the watching figures in the distance. She said that staying did change something, even if he could not see it yet. And Elias let out a breath that barely disturbed the air, a breath that carried something older than the town behind them, something worn thin by time and memory. And he turned slightly, not toward her, not fully away, but enough to show that he was listening despite himself. And Clara continued, choosing her words with care, not to convince, but to reveal what she had already begun to understand. She told him that the boy would remember today, not the fear in the crowd, not the whispers, but the man who stepped forward when no one else did. And that kind of memory did not disappear just because a town chose to look the other way. And for a moment, the space between them felt smaller, not in distance, but in weight, as if something unseen had shifted just enough to let a different truth through. And Elias glanced past her, toward the figures watching from afar, their outlines sharper now against the fading light. And he knew what came next, the questions, the doubt, the quiet resistance that always followed anything that challenged what people had already decided to believe. And he had lived that moment before, more times than he cared to count. And each time it had ended the same way, with him walking away and the story remaining unchanged. But this time was different, not because of the town, not because of what had happened in the street, but because Clara Whitfield had stepped into a place no one else had, and she had not stepped back. And that simple fact carried more weight than any rumor ever could. And Elias turned back toward her fully now, just for a second, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that did not belong to fear. And then he did what he had always done. He took a step away from the town, toward the open land. But this time, it was slower, less certain, as if he was no longer sure that leaving would solve what staying might finally change. And behind Clara, the figures at the edge of Whisper Creek did not move closer, but they did not turn away either, because for the first time, the story they had believed was no longer the only one being told. The road stretched ahead of Elias Crow in a long, empty line, the kind that promised distance but never quite delivered peace. And each step he took carried the same quiet certainty he had lived by for years, that leaving was easier than staying, that silence was safer than being known. But behind him, Clara Whitfield did not return to town, and that was the part he could not ignore. Not the watching figures, not the weight of their judgment, but the single pair of footsteps that did not fade away, steady and unhurried, following not out of curiosity, but out of choice. And after nearly 20 yards, he stopped, not abruptly, but with the slow realization that whatever this was, it would not end the way it always had. And when he turned, Clara was still there, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to pretend she had changed her mind, and the distance between them felt deliberate, like something both of them understood without needing to speak. And the wind moved again, softer now, carrying less dust, more stillness, and Clara met his gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not pleading, just present. And that presence unsettled him more than fear ever had, because fear was something he knew how to answer, how to step around. But this was different. This was someone refusing to look away, and Elias let his eyes drift briefly toward the horizon, as if searching for the version of himself that would have kept walking, the one who would not have stopped, who would have let the town keep its story intact. But that man felt farther away now, quieter, less certain, and Clara spoke again, her voice carrying easily across the space between them. She said that the town would keep talking, whether he stayed or left, that people always did, but what they said did not have to be the only truth that remained. And Elias listened, not because he agreed, but because he could not find a reason to dismiss her, and that was new. And for a long moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching not as a barrier, but as something waiting to be filled. And then Elias did something small, almost invisible. He set his hat back down on the fence rail beside him, not as a sign of surrender, not as a promise, but as a pause, a decision delayed instead of avoided. And Clara noticed, of course she did, because she had been watching the details no one else cared to see, and she understood that this was not a victory, not even close, but it was something, a shift in a pattern that had held for too long. And behind them, the figures at the edge of Whisper Creek had grown slightly closer, not enough to join, not enough to interfere, but enough to show that they were still watching, still trying to understand what they were seeing. And Elias glanced in their direction once more, then back to Clara, and for the first time since he had arrived in that town, he did not immediately choose distance. He chose to remain where he was, just for that moment, just long enough to let something unfamiliar settle in the space between them, something quieter than fear, steadier than rumor. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the open land, Elias Crow stood not as the man the town believed him to be, but as someone standing at the edge of a different choice, one he had not allowed himself to consider until now. The sun had begun its slow descent, stretching shadows across the dry ground like long fingers reaching for something just out of sight. And Elias Crow stood there with his hat resting on the fence beside him, a small, quiet decision that felt heavier than any words he could have spoken, because for a man who had built his life on leaving, even a pause carried weight. And Clara Whitfield understood that better than he expected. She did not rush him, did not fill the silence with questions or reassurances. She simply remained, steady as the horizon behind her, and that steadiness did something the town never could. It gave space instead of pressure. And Elias found himself noticing things he usually ignored, the way the wind had softened, the way the distant voices had quieted into something more watchful than fearful, the way Clara did not look at him like a problem to be solved, but like a man still standing, and that difference unsettled him in a way he could not easily name, because it asked something of him he had not given in a long time, not effort, not explanation, but presence, and that was harder than either. And after a while, he spoke again, his voice low, careful, like something that had not been used enough. He said that people saw what they expected to see, and Clara nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding, and she answered that sometimes they only saw what they were afraid to question, and the words hung there, simple, but carrying a truth that did not need to be forced. And Elias glanced toward the town again, where a few figures still lingered at the edge, no longer hiding their attention, but not yet stepping forward, caught between what they had always believed and what they had just witnessed, and he knew that kind of moment, knew how quickly it could disappear if no one held it steady. And for years, he had chosen not to be the one who tried, because trying meant risking something he had already lost too many times. But Clara stood there without asking him to prove anything, without demanding he stay or go, and that made the choice feel different, less like a trap, more like something he could step into on his own terms, and slowly, almost without realizing it, Elias reached for the small leather bag that rested near the fence, the one he carried everywhere, worn from years of use, and he adjusted the strap over his shoulder, not preparing to leave, but settling it into place, like a man who might still have work to do. And Clara noticed that too. Of course she did, because she had been watching the things that mattered, not the ones that made noise. And she allowed herself the smallest shift in her posture, a quiet sign that she saw the difference, that she understood what it meant. And behind them, one of the figures near the town took a step forward, then another, hesitant, unsure, but moving nonetheless, and Elias saw it from the corner of his eye, the beginning of something fragile, something that could either grow or collapse depending on what happened next. And for the first time in a long while, he did not turn away from it. He remained where he was, standing in the open with Clara Whitfield beside him, not as a man running from what others believed, but as someone allowing a different story the chance to take shape, one step at a time. One quiet moment held just long enough to matter. The man who stepped forward from the edge of Whisper Creek did not come far. Only a few yards past where the dust road began to fade into open land. But it was enough to be noticed, enough to change the shape of the moment, because until then, everything that had happened existed between Elias Crow and Clara Whitfield alone, a quiet exchange held in still air, but now it belonged to more than just them, and Elias felt it immediately, not as pressure, not yet, but as awareness. The kind that told him the world he had kept at a distance was beginning to step closer on its own terms, and he did not move to meet it. He simply stood where he was, shoulders steady, hands relaxed at his sides, the leather strap of his bag resting against his chest like a reminder of who he had been before this town decided who he was. And Clara turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the man approaching without breaking the line that held her beside Elias. And the man stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to keep the old boundaries intact. And for a second, he hesitated, as if unsure whether he was allowed to be there at all. And then he spoke, not loudly, not with accusation, but with something quieter, something uncertain. He asked if the boy would truly be all right. And Elias did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he understood the weight of that question was not about the boy alone. It was about everything the town had believed for years. And Clara glanced at him, not urging, not expecting, just present. And after a moment, Elias nodded once, the same small, steady motion he had given before. And that was all. No explanation, no reassurance beyond what he could stand behind. And the man seemed to take that in, slowly, as if measuring it against the stories he had carried. And behind him, another figure moved closer, then another, not in a rush, not as a crowd, but as individuals stepping out of something they were no longer certain of. And the distance between town and open land began to shrink, not in feet, but in understanding. and Elias watched it happen without stepping back, without retreating into the silence he had always chosen, and that alone changed the moment more than anything he could have said, because for the first time, he allowed himself to be seen without turning away, and Clara felt it, the shift moving through the air like something settling into place, fragile, uncertain, but real, and she remained beside him, not as protection, not as proof, but as someone who had chosen to witness what others had ignored, and the sun dipped lower behind them, casting long shadows that stretched from the town toward the open land, blending the two spaces together in a way that made it harder to tell where one ended and the other began. And in that fading light, Elias Crow stood not as a man feared, not yet as a man understood, but as someone no longer hidden behind the distance others had created, and the people of Whisper Creek, one step at a time, were beginning to see what Clara had seen first, not all at once, not easily, but enough to make them stay, enough to make them look, and for the first time, no one asked him to leave. The second man, who stepped forward, carried more than hesitation. He carried memory, and it showed in the way his eyes lingered on Elias Crow longer than the others, as if trying to reconcile what he had just seen with something older, something he had told himself for years. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than the first man's, but no less uncertain. He said he remembered a winter 3 years back when a traveler had fallen ill near the outskirts of town, and no one had wanted to go out in the cold, not at night, not with the storm rolling in, but someone had gone anyway, someone who had stayed until morning, and Elias did not respond, did not confirm, did not deny. But the silence that followed carried its own weight, and Clara Whitfield turned her head slightly, watching the man as much as Elias, because she understood that this was how truth returned, not in declarations, but in fragments, in pieces people had chosen to forget until something forced them to remember. And the man shifted his stance, glancing briefly at the others behind him, as if searching for agreement. But what he found instead was the same uncertainty reflected back, and that was enough to keep him speaking. He said that the traveler had not survived, and that, afterward, people had talked, said that anyone who tried to help near the end only made things worse, that it was better not to interfere, better to let things take their course. And Elias lowered his gaze for a moment, not in shame, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement of something that had never left him, and Clara saw it clearly now, the pattern that had followed him from place to place, not a trail of harm, but a trail of moments where he had arrived too late, stayed too long, carried what others refused to carry, and been left with the silence that followed. And the man's voice softened as he spoke again, slower this time, as if each word required more effort than the last. He said that he had always wondered who that man had been, the one who stayed through the night when no one else would. And for a brief second, the distance between them felt thinner, not because the answer was spoken, but because it no longer needed to be. And Elias lifted his head again, meeting the man's eyes without deflection, without the practiced avoidance he had relied on for years. And in that look was something simple, something unguarded, the truth without explanation. And the man nodded, almost to himself, as if something had settled into place that he could not easily undo. And behind him, the others remained still, but their silence had changed, no longer heavy with fear, but filled with something quieter, something closer to understanding. And Clara felt it move through the group like a slow current, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that did not announce itself, but left everything slightly altered in its wake. And Elias did not step away from it, did not retreat into distance or silence. He simply remained, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. And as the last light of day stretched across the land, the story Whisper Creek had carried for so long began to loosen its hold, not broken, not erased, but no longer standing alone, because for the first time, the people who had feared him were beginning to remember something they had once chosen to forget, that the man they kept at a distance had always been the one who stayed when others walked away. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with the kind of understanding that does not arrive all at once but settles slowly, like dust after a long day. And Elias Crow felt it in the way no one stepped back this time, in the way the distance between him and the people of Whisper Creek no longer grew with every passing second. And Clara Whitfield remained at his side, not speaking, because she understood that this moment did not belong to words. It belonged to what people chose to see when nothing forced them to. Look away, and the man who had spoken earlier lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again with something steadier behind it. Not certainty, not yet, but the beginning of it. And he said quietly that maybe they had been wrong, not loudly, not for the others, but enough that it carried, enough that it reached ears that had grown used to hearing only one version of the truth, and the words did not change everything. They did not erase years of distance or doubt, but they shifted something important. They made room, and behind him, another voice followed, softer, uncertain, asking what else they might not have seen, and Elias did not answer. He never did in moments like this, because explanations had never changed anything for him. Only actions had, and even those had not always been enough. But Clara turned slightly, just enough to face the small group now standing closer than they had ever dared before, and she spoke with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning. She said that sometimes a man is not what people fear, but what they refuse to understand, and the words settled into the air between them, not as a challenge, but as something to be considered, and the people listened, really listened, because they no longer had the comfort of turning away, and Elias stood there, still as ever. But something in him had changed, not in the way he held himself, not in the way he breathed, but in the way he no longer seemed ready to leave at the first sign of being seen. And that was new. That was something even he did not fully understand yet. And as the last light of day began to fade into a softer dusk, one of the older men from town stepped forward, slower than the others, carrying the weight of years in his posture, and he stopped a few feet from Elias, close enough to speak without raising his voice. And he said that there were others in town who might need help, small things, quiet things, nothing urgent, but things that had been left unattended because no one wanted to ask for help from someone they did not trust. And the offer hung there, simple, uncertain, not quite an apology, not quite a request, but something in between, and Elias looked at him, then at Clara, and for the first time since he had arrived in Whisper Creek, he did not feel like a man standing outside a story. He felt like someone being invited into it. Not fully, not without hesitation, but enough to make him pause, enough to make him consider what staying might mean if the story itself was beginning to change. And he gave a small nod, not a promise, not a commitment, but an acknowledgement that he had heard. And that was enough, enough for the moment, enough for the people watching to understand that something had shifted in a way that could not easily be undone. And as the town stood there in the fading light, no longer turning away, no longer certain of what they had believed, Elias Crow remained where he was, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time, he was not being asked to leave. The offer did not echo. It settled, quiet and steady, like something that had been waiting longer than anyone wanted to admit. And Elias Crow stood with that small nod still lingering in the space between him and the people of Whisper Creek. Not a promise, but not a refusal either. And Clara Whitfield felt the weight of that moment more than anyone else, because she understood how rare it was for a man like him to stop walking. And she did not speak. She did not rush to fill what had been left open. She simply remained, letting the silence do what words could not. And the older man shifted his stance, as if unsure whether to say more or step back. And in that hesitation, another voice rose from behind him, a woman this time, her tone softer, almost careful. She said there was a child who had not been sleeping well for weeks. Nothing serious, just restlessness, worry, the kind that lingers without showing itself. And the way she spoke made it clear she was not asking for a miracle, only for someone to try. And Elias listened, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture eased, just slightly, the kind of change that would go unnoticed by most, but not by Clara. And she saw it for what it was, not confidence, not yet, but willingness, and that alone was enough to shift the air again. And Elias reached for his bag, not with urgency, not with reluctance, but with the steady motion of someone who had carried it long enough to know its weight without looking. And when he adjusted the strap over his shoulder, it no longer looked like preparation to leave. It looked like readiness to stay, at least for now. And the people watching seemed to understand that, because no one spoke over him, no one rushed forward. They simply made space, not out of fear this time, but out of something quieter, something closer to respect. And Elias took a step toward the town, slow, deliberate, and the ground between them no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a path, one that had always been there but had never been used, and Clara moved with him, not ahead, not behind, but beside, her presence steady as ever. And as they walked those first few yards back toward Whisper Creek, the town itself seemed different, not in its buildings or its streets, but in the way it held them, less guarded, less certain of its old judgments. And the people who had once turned away now stood watching without stepping back, their silence no longer sharp, but thoughtful. And Elias did not look at them directly, he never had, but he did not lower his gaze either. He walked forward with the same quiet purpose he had always carried. Only now it was not pulling him away, it was leading him in, and Clara felt it in every step, the shift from distance to presence, from rumor to something real. And as they reached the edge where the first wooden buildings cast their shadows across the road, Elias slowed just slightly, not from doubt, but from awareness, because this was the part that mattered most. Not the moment of change, but what came after, and Clara glanced at him briefly, not to guide, not to reassure, but to acknowledge that she understood the weight of it too, and neither of them spoke, because some moments did not need words, they needed only the courage to continue. And Elias Crow, for the first time in a long while, did not turn away from what waited ahead. The town did not welcome Elias Crow with words, it welcomed him with space. The kind that used to push him out, but now opened just enough to let him pass. And as he stepped onto the wooden boards of the first walkway, the sound beneath his boots felt different, not louder, not softer, but noticed, and Clara Whitfield walked beside him without speaking, her presence steady as ever, as if she understood that this part of the journey required nothing more than being there. And the people of Whisper Creek watched, not hiding now, not pretending they had not seen what had happened beyond the edge of town. And in their eyes there was still uncertainty, still doubt, but it no longer held the same sharp edge. It had softened into something quieter, something that asked instead of judged, and the woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward from the group, her hands clasped together as if holding something fragile, and she nodded once toward Elias. Not a full greeting, not quite trust, but something closer than either had been before, and she turned, leading the way toward a small house near the center of town, and Elias followed, not because he was certain of what would come next, but because he had chosen, for the first time in a long while, not to walk away before the moment had a chance to unfold, and the door to the house opened slowly, revealing a dim interior where the light filtered through thin curtains, casting long, quiet shadows across the floor, and inside, a child lay resting, eyes open but distant, the kind of restlessness that came not from pain but from something harder to name. And Elias paused at the threshold, not out of fear, but out of habit, waiting for the unspoken permission he had learned to expect, and the woman stepped aside, giving it without words, and that alone marked a shift greater than anything said aloud. And Elias stepped inside, the air cooler, still, carrying the faint scent of wood and fabric, and he set his bag down carefully, opening it with practiced hands, each movement deliberate, familiar. And Clara remained near the doorway, not intruding, not observing as an outsider, but standing within the moment as someone who had helped bring it into being. And Elias knelt beside the child, his presence calm, his voice quiet as he spoke a few simple words, not commands, not instructions, but reassurance, the kind that does not promise anything beyond attention. And the child's breathing steadied, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw gasps, but in a subtle, steady rhythm that spoke of comfort more than cure, and the room held that stillness, the kind that does not demand belief, only patience. And outside, the town remained gathered, not pressing in, not pulling away, but waiting, because something had begun that could not be undone by stepping back into what they had once believed. And Clara watched Elias as he worked, not with urgency, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had always known what to do even when no one had trusted him to do it. And in that moment, the truth of who he was no longer needed to be spoken. It was there, in every careful movement, in every quiet breath. And as the light inside the room softened with the coming evening, Whisper Creek stood on the edge of something it had never allowed before. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. And Elias Crow, for the first time, was not standing outside of it. The room remained quiet long after Elias Crow stepped back from the child's bedside, not because something dramatic had happened, but because something subtle had settled into place. The kind of change that does not announce itself, only reveals itself in what no longer feels heavy. And the child's breathing stayed even, steady in a way that let the mother's shoulders lower for the first time in weeks. And she did not speak right away. She simply watched, as if afraid that words might disturb what had finally come to rest. And Elias closed his bag slowly, each movement deliberate, familiar. And when he stood, he did not look for praise, did not wait for thanks. He only gave a small nod, the same quiet gesture he had offered all along, and turned toward the door as if the moment belonged to them now, not to him. And Clara Whitfield stepped aside to let him pass, her eyes following him not with surprise, but with understanding, because she had seen this before. The way he left before anything could tie him to a place. The way he chose distance over recognition, not out of pride, but out of habit. And outside, the people of Whisper Creek still stood gathered, not as a crowd demanding answers, but as individuals holding a silence they no longer knew how to fill. And when Elias stepped into the fading light, no one moved to block his path. No one called out. They simply watched. And in that watching there was something new, something that had not been there before. Not fear, not judgment, but respect, quiet and unspoken. And Elias felt it. Even if he did not turn to meet their eyes, he felt it in the way the air no longer pressed against him, in the way the space around him did not close as he walked. And Clara followed him out, stopping just short of the doorway, her gaze resting on the town, then on him, as if holding both truths at once. And for a moment, it seemed like he might continue on, might step past the last building, past the edge where the land opened wide and familiar. But he did not. Not right away. He slowed, just slightly, his boots pausing against the wooden boards, and he glanced back, not fully, just enough to take in what stood behind him. The people who had once turned away, now standing still, not asking him to leave, not demanding he stay, but allowing him to choose. And Clara saw it, the weight of that choice, the way it rested on him differently now, no longer shaped by what others believed, but by what he had allowed himself to become. And she did not speak, because she knew some decisions needed silence to be made honestly. And after a moment that felt longer than it was, Elias Crow adjusted the strap of his bag once more, not as a sign of departure, but as a man settling into something he had not planned. And he turned back toward the town, not quickly, not with certainty, but with a quiet acceptance that he no longer needed to walk away to remain whole. And the people of Whisper Creek did not cheer, did not rush forward. They simply made room. And in that space, something real finally took hold. Not forgiveness spoken aloud, not trust declared in words, but something steadier, something that would not vanish with the next rumor. And Clara Whitfield watched him step forward, not as the man they had feared, not as the man they misunderstood, but as someone who had always been there, waiting for a moment when being seen did not mean being pushed away. And as the last light of day faded into a quiet dusk, the town stood still, not because it had no more to say, but because for the first time, it understood that some truths are not meant to be spoken, only lived. And Elias Crow, who had carried silence for so long, no longer carried it alone.